This is Gary. This episode was rather inconveniently recorded before the Trump verdict. Conveniently, though, it hasn't changed my view on what's happened and its significance, so we've decided to keep it in. Hi, I'm Gary Young.
And I'm Carys. Every week, Gary and I will be talking about those stories in the news that are overreported and the ones that are going completely under the radar and not being talked about enough.
And in between all of that, myself and Carys will chat all things life, from dating apps to Donald Trump.
Make sure you sign up to our newsletter at overunderpod.com.
This is Over the Top and Under the Radar. Carys, I want to take us back to episode 1. Your Over the Top just 2 weeks ago was about Angela Rayner and the Greater Manchester Police investigating allegations of tax fraud. Was it tax fraud?
Angela Rayner was being accused of not paying capital gains tax and also potentially of having committed voter fraud. Greater Manchester Police have said there's no crime to investigate and Angela Rayner is free to campaign, have a coffee, whatever she wants to do. I imagine it's just going to be campaigning with the general election. And Gary, your Over the Top was about Diane Abbott. Again, pretty prescient. She's been in the news quite a lot. Do you want to talk us through what's been happening?
Well, weirdly, it was about Natalie Elphicke, actually, but I used Diane Abbott as an example of so Labour are going to embrace this woman who's lived her life fighting against all of its principles, but they're not going to allow Diane Abbott in. Last Friday, Keir Starmer says, this issue is still not resolved. Turns out it was resolved in February, but she still wasn't allowed back into the parliamentary Labour Party until the BBC broke the story that actually they've made the decision. So what are they waiting for? At which point they did allow her back into the parliamentary party. But according to Diane, there were conditions. You can come back into the party, but you can't stand as an MP. Keir Starmer now says, well, he didn't say that. But then since we've caught him in a lie already on this, why would we believe him? They're clearly making a calculation here. They're making a calculation that black people don't really matter, that black frustration at the way they're being treated doesn't really matter, that there are more votes to be gained through this treatment, this nakedly racist treatment, given the disproportionality, given the way that other people are treated, that they would rather have the votes of a section of the white population that likes to see a black woman humiliated than actually do right by one of the most long-standing MPs and Britain's first black woman MP. Electorally, they might be right. Politically, I think they're very wrong, and morally, they're completely wrong. It's really, really awful. And I'll tell you what it reminds me of as just on a personal level was when I was 16 or 17, I got a call from my mum. My mum was a teacher and she was in tears and she said, come and get me. And what happened was these bigoted kids had carved racist insults into her desk. She'd asked the school for a new desk. They said no. She asked the union to intervene. And then the union said no. And they said no in such a horrible way that when I went to the school, she was sitting in the corner of the staff room in tears. And her colleagues who were there just kind of trying to pretend that nothing had happened. And I walked in and I got her stuff and I said, let's go. And this is what it reminds me of, this thing, but black women, they don't matter. Doesn't matter. There's no price to pay for humiliating them. And this was from a trade union. And this notion that we support these things. I support these things. But we do these things knowing the people who we're going into battle with don't always have our back. And that's what I felt when I looked at Diane. And there was the Tory guy who had racially insulted her, and then Labour now racially insulting her, and they think there's no price to pay. And there has to be a price to pay for treating people like this.
The thing that sits with me is that you were 16 and you had to deal with that at 16. And for a lot of us, it's a very young age at which we are made to feel that our presence in this country is conditional, that we might have a passport, but we're not full citizens. The Diane stuff has been sitting with me a lot as well, sitting heavily. I think the thing that makes me the most angry and frustrated is that, and it's a very well-known study that a lot of people cite, Amnesty International did an analysis of the abuse that women received on Twitter and looked at female politicians in the UK. And 45% of the abuse directed to female politicians in the UK was directed to Diane Abbott. She skewed the sample. This is a woman who is a political legend who, when I was, a babe in arms, because I'm very young, Gary, in the 80s, made history as the first Black woman to be elected to Parliament. And the Labour Party, the party that's meant to be the party of social justice, their response to Diane Abbott's continued abuse, to threats to her safety. The Tory donor who was caught on a hot mic talking about Diane Abbott said that she should be shot. And the response of this Labour Party is to side with the bullies and to bully her. And I would say cynically, because they think that headlines where it shows they're attacking Diane Abbott will appeal to a group of voters that they want to win over.
I kind of think it's even worse than that in two ways. And the first is that they actually sent out a mailer trying to raise money on the back of Diane Abbott's oppression. Like, look at how awful the Tories were, even as they refused to allow her into the parliamentary party, first of all. But secondly, there are 16-year-old kids watching how Diane Abbott is being treated. And in the same way that when you were probably in your teens.
In the 80s?
87.
I was born in 86.
Are you that young?
I'm that young, Gary.
Get off the podcast, man. Bring me an adult.
Don't come at
Bring me an
right?
adult. Right. Okay. So you don't remember Diane's election. But so you grew up with that as a kind of fact. I grew up with it as an event. But imagine growing up with this as a fact, that this is what they can do. Really appalling. But where we got to in that episode was, you saying, why would any young person, particularly a young person of color, why would they stand? They're going to bully you. And sure enough, right on the back of Diane Abbott comes the treatment of Faiza Shaheen, who I know is a good friend of yours. So just talk us through what's happened there.
So for those who don't know, Faiza Shaheen, who's a young Muslim woman, was a Labour candidate for Chingford and Woodford Green. We worked together about 10 years ago. Then a few years ago, she decided to join the Labour Party and stand in her home seat in Chingford and Woodford Green. She was born in the local hospital. She went to the local school. She used to work at the Greggs on Chingford Mount. Like, this is her area. She lives there now. And she stood as a Labour candidate in 2019. And she worked really hard. She inspired a lot of people. And in an election where Labour got battered, Faiza beat the national swing. More people voted Labour in Chingford and Woodford Green. And she made Ian Duncan Smith's majority so small that this seat is now a marginal. And the thing that happened to Faiza this week, she received an email at 12 o'clock on Tuesday telling her she had a meeting that she had to attend at 6 p.m. on Zoom about her candidacy. Faiza's a young mum. She didn't see the email till 3. So at 6 p.m, she joins a Zoom. She doesn't have childcare. The baby's crying. She can't hear what they're saying a lot of the time. And a panel of Labour Party staffers and NEC members, so panel of Labour Party people who aren't elected politicians, read a series of tweets that she's liked over the last 10 years. And she is asked to explain the tweets and explain how they will affect Labour's electoral chances in Chingford. My experience of this really was my friend calling me really upset yesterday. By the end of the evening, she had received an email saying she was no longer the Labour candidate for Chingford. She was selected by local members. And the thing that really sticks in the craw, Gary, was that she was told she would harm the Labour Party's chances of getting elected. That is provably false. Let me be very clear what's happened here. A young Muslim woman who is on the left, but it's not about that, Gary. It's not about her being on the left. This isn't about her politics. This is about a small group of people, most of them are men, sitting in Labour HQ, high on poll numbers, They want to put someone in that seat that they know and they like. And the consequence of that is the Labour Party, the party of working people, are taking a working class woman of colour off the ballot. And the way they did it, the manner in which they did it, smacks of the fact that they are bullies and they are cowards. And if you want proof that they're cowards, they didn't put a single person up on Newsnight last night to talk about Diane or to talk about Pfizer. And that tells you all you need to know about these people who hide behind their laptops and sit on WhatsApp sending gossipy messages to journalists.
I think it is because they're left-wing. I think that if Pfizer was a working class Muslim woman who supported the bombing of Gaza, was prepared to do everything that she was told, I don't think they would have done that.
Yeah, if she was like a tame woman of colour who repeated the party line on Gaza, although it does change quite a lot, so it would be hard to stay consistent on that. Sure, but I think I don't want to lose she's a human being and that this stuff is sexist and it is racist. I mean, if I lived in Chingford, I'd be pretty angry if I were a Labour member.
There's another element to this that I do want to talk about, which is, this is, for me, what is very challenging in this moment, because my desire is that the Tories lose. That is my desire. We can't afford more austerity and all the rest of it. The only people who can beat them in this awful first past the post system that we have is Labour. But I also really need them to be better. I am in Diane Abbott's constituency. And as I said in the first episode, if she doesn't stand, now that the process has been so contaminated, I think anybody who steps into that role is kind of, to my mind, is kind of flawed. Labour's made up my mind in Hackney that I will be campaigning and working hard for the Greens to defeat a Labour candidate. The Tories can't win in Hackney, but I still want the Tories to lose nationally. And to want the Tories to lose is to need Labour to win. But my heart is not in it. And increasingly, I struggle for a strategy in a system that provides so few options, which is so kind of morally bankrupt.
I think that's the heart of the tragedy, isn't it? The Labour Party is still the best option, the least worst option at this election. That tragedy was summed up by literally 24 hours after this kangaroo court told Faiza Shaheen that because of some tweets she liked, she couldn't be the Labour candidate for her area. She was knocking on doors because Labour is still the best option for us. I don't think we can expect compassion or decency from this Labour leadership. So then the question becomes, how do we organise for a better Labour Party that serves the people it claims to represent?
So first of all, I was a Labour Party member from about, 87 to 92, when you were an infant child. And I left in 92, partly because I was in Labour Students and had to deal with quite a lot of this stuff. And I just thought, I'm done. I was young and I thought, I've been fighting my own side the whole time. This is not the best use of my time. My psychic energy is making me miserable. Basically, fuck these people. I might vote for them, but that's as much as they're getting. You are still, I think, a member of the Labour Party. And I'm wondering what a week like this does to your thinking about being a member of the Labour Party.
I'm still a member of the Labour Party. I received an email this morning from them asking for £5. You can imagine my face. I joined the party in 2007. I was 21. I'm at the point where I wouldn't ask anyone else to join, which isn't a great sign. And so the only thing keeping me in is bloody mindedness. Whose Labour is this and why do you get to decide what the Labour Party is? I do feel like I'm at the end of the road, and I was, talking to a friend about whether this is the last nail in the coffin for me. And I don't know if I want them to have my money, those people who are bullies and who aren't actually that good at politics. And just make no mistake, they hold the white working class people in the red wall seats that they're trying to get the votes of. They hold them in the same contempt that they hold many of us. We're all just pawns on a chessboard to them. Well, I think that's enough about the Labour Party, Gary.
For this year.
Shall we proceed?
So, Carys, what's your over the top for this week?
The thing I think has been over-reported this week in the media, 2 words, national service, or as one very witty social media user branded it, Nashy Serv.
It's lovely that it's already got a nickname. A thing that won't happen and that is completely stupid has already got a nickname. And the nickname doesn't really make sense.
Okay, so Nashy Serv, national service. I'm guessing most listeners will be familiar with this. Rishi Sunak and the Conservatives began the general election campaign by announcing mandatory national service for 18-year-olds for 12 months as a flagship policy that they will bring in September 2025, Carrie, should they win in July. I'm actually not against the idea of national service, which I would love to discuss with you. I think the thing that was particularly awful about this policy announcement is this generation of young people have it really hard. They've got a housing crisis. There's a skills crisis in terms of developed or wealthy countries. Our young people are some of the least skilled, especially if they didn't go to university. 500,000 18 to 24-year-olds have been prescribed antidepressants. There's a mental health crisis. In 2000, 24% of young people said they had a mental health problem. In 2021, 34% of young people said they had a mental health problem. The one trend that has happened over the last few decades that you can read about in the British Social Attitude Survey is there's a bit of a polarization in our politics based on age. So back in the 80s, whether you were 22 or 65 wasn't a huge determinant or factor in what your politics were, according to the British Social Attitude Survey, which is a pretty big study. People were about as likely to sit on different parts of the political spectrum. Last year, we saw that there's a big polarization and young people are much more likely to be left-wing and much less likely to vote Conservative. So again, cynical political offer, appeal to older people who might vote Tory by kicking the young.
It seems to me incredibly retro, first of all, but also, is that what we need? More young people who are skilled in shooting and killing and like of all of the kind of skills that who are we fighting right now? What is this for? Do you know what I mean? And you said like you're kind of for national service, and I'm intrigued in that because probably one of the most middle class things that I've done pre like 25. After that, it all gets a bit, mozzarella. But before then, I did take a year between school and university. I mean, I'm not apologizing for it at all. And I did find it incredibly rewarding, incredibly fulfilling, as well as creating lifelong friendships. It did, as part of the maturing process, it was huge. I'm not against that as a notion, but the idea that it's compulsory, I think, is a problem. It's not for everyone. So what's you're in favour of national service?
Well, so I didn't do a gap year. I have volunteered. My pitch, Gary, is slightly different from Nashy Serv. I don't think we get the 18-year-olds doing it. And I don't think it should be mandatory. I do think we should have national service for older people.
Yes.
Hear me out. There's a loneliness crisis. NHS estimates 2 million over 75s are lonely. National service for a year. Top up the pension maybe, or not. Volunteer, that'd be better.
See, I'm wondering, Carys, if this is young-splaining. You're kind of...
Am I being ageist?
I think that all of the things that you mentioned make sense because they were volunteers. It was volunteering. I know there's a crisis of loneliness. That is important. That feels to me like kind of late-stage capitalism stuff. I'm not sure that, bearing in mind, Carys, I'm 55.
I see.
When does this start? When are you going to do this service to kind of
55? Mandatory.
55.
No. I think okay. So no, good point taken. How about some sort of social mixing between the generations? Social clubs, and then a bit of volunteering. Volunteering's fun.
I think these things need to be resourced, and I do share with you. And bear in mind, I lost my mum when she was quite young, so there was that in my personal life. But that we lack, particularly in the black community, but not solely by any means, but that's where I experience it. What I call intergenerational transmission. So kind of some understanding of what parents and grandparents go through and some understanding of what kids go through. And in the absence of that, what you get is older people saying, every generation of older people, this is black or white, talk about the kids like, in my day, we were bare, you're rubbish. You know, I've heard, for example, black people say, kids spend all their time on their phones. They're not interested in politics. They spend all their time on their phones. And I'm like, they organize demonstrations on their phones. That's what their Black Lives Matter was, kids on their phones, transmitting stuff, amplifying stuff, organizing things. So I feel like there is a dislocation between the generations, and it plays out differently with different groups. It's not unique to black people, but as I said, that's why I feel it keenly.
Yes. Okay. So what we agreed on is volunteering is good, maybe not mandatory for older or younger people, and some sort of intergenerational mixers. So, okay, if you're listening, how are we going to fix Nashy Serv? What should it be?
My under the radar is South Africa. Their elections are coming up. It's an issue in a place that's very close to my heart because South Africa is where I got my big break in 94, covering the first elections, the Mandela elections. I was young then. And it was electric. It was amazing. You would be in these sort of rickety stadia and people that hadn't seen Mandela on telly because they didn't have tellies. They'd just seen him on a poster. I followed him around for much of his campaign. You'd see his entourage, kind of the cavalcade coming. And these townships are built in the middle of nowhere. So you could see for miles and you could just see the cavalcade kicking up dust. And then people would start screaming and ululating and singing, and kids with no shoes and women with no teeth. And Mandela would get out and he'd wave his feet. It was amazing. Now they're coming up for elections. And there are a few things I think to remember. One thing in particular to remember about South Africa at the time in 94, the fear was, the kind of narrative theme was, this country is about to fall apart. There is going to be slaughter. And you have to remember that just up the road, not long after those elections, was the Rwandan genocide. And people saying, Inkatha, Zulus, Gatabutalese, all of these different ethnicities, they're not going to be able to keep it together. And that didn't happen. They did keep it together. They produced one of the most progressive constitutions, I think the first state to formally recognize gay relationships in its constitution. What they didn't do is deliver for a large amount of their base. And coming up to these elections, it might be the first time that the ANC go below 50%. And also there's been a slump in turnout, which given how hard they had to fight for the vote is disappointing. There is a kind of increase in xenophobia, particularly against Zimbabwean migrants. So the country's got lots of problems. And in a range of ways, domestically, the ANC is underdelivered. Although we do have to understand that in the context of what was expected. But it's still underdelivered. And it's run the country on its own for 30 years. That's not good for anyone.
It's the only party that's been the party.
Yeah.
Government.
I also think it's important to understand that, or in my mind, to celebrate that the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, the ruling that they brought down on Israel, that it was plausible they were committing genocide, that came from the ANC and from its tradition. And it made me proud and pleased to see this black-led African country teaching the world what justice means.
Yeah, it was a beautiful moment. You're right. It has been underreported. I haven't seen a lot of conversations about the anniversary. I think it's bittersweet, right? Because it's a time when the left won, when the socially just thing happened, and also the economic inequality in South Africa is pretty huge and pretty desperate. And the ANC haven't delivered for everyone that voted for them and supported them. But yeah, I think the thing I'm interested in is this idea of it's also the challenge of the Revolutionary Party becoming the party of government. And I think it's true across at least African liberation movements. And I think it's worth, I guess, having a bit of compassion for the ANC, because you're talking about a group of people who for decades had to operate with a hierarchy, had to operate on trust, and had to operate in secrecy. You know, there was an armed wing of the ANC in Quinto Sizwe, and there was infiltration, and they were up against a very powerful and invasive state. So it's that thing where the thing it took to be a good revolutionary leader, to be a successful liberation army, is then not necessarily what you need to be a good, effective democratic party, although are there any of those anywhere? Do you think there's political hope in South Africa? What do you think is going to happen in this election? Zuma's still there, isn't he? Still holding on?
Yeah, I was at the service, the big service in Soweto after Mandela died. Zuma spoke and there was booing in the crowd. And it was interesting how the booing happened, because it started at some distance from where I was. It gained pace as other people thought, oh, people are booing. You know, Zuma was a mess, I think. There is the EFF, which is a kind of Marxist-inspired, the Economic Freedom Fighters, I think they're called. But then there is also a threat from the right, from the Democratic Alliance, the DA. First of all, there is the issue of low turnout, which is also, we talked about that last week, and that's also an issue here. And if people don't find a buy-in, then of course it does matter who wins, but they do have decreased legitimacy. But then it's not clear to me if the ANC's loss will end up being the gain of the right or the left. And the polling in South Africa, because lots of people don't have phones, will be insufficient. My guess is, as is often the case, the people who are most likely to stay at home are the people who I would most likely want to vote. And so the low turnout will serve the right and not the left, would be my guess.
As we're recording this, there isn't an election result, but potentially as you're listening to this, we might have a result. But yeah, I think there's a through line to a few things we've spoken about. There's a lot of young people in South Africa, on the continent of Africa generally, as we see in many countries around the world. Political leaders are older. They don't represent most people. And I think this is as true of South Africa as the United States, as the UK. I think politicians have a sell-by date. Like, I think they go off like milk.
You are really down on older people today. Can I just say that?
I think I'm ageist. No, I'm not down on older people, but I think people should plan to transition out and be cultivating younger generations of people in politics.
There is something about entitlement. Bear in mind that we have been talking about the veteran Labour MP who's been in power for 37 years in Hackney. So there is that.
And he still does a great job as the MP for Hackney.
By that standard, then, people can do well, but it's hard. There is a sense of entitlement that comes with being in power. This is slightly different, but not entirely. I always thought, and bearing in mind this would have impinged on me, that newspaper columnists should only get to write for 5 years as a column, and then they should be made to go and report or go on a desk or something, and that they should be rotated because, and I felt this myself as someone who had a column for too long, probably, your voice gets hoarse. You start repeating yourself. You start thinking, oh, bloody hell, what will I do this week? It takes a little while to get into it and to get used to it and to not make a bunch of mistakes. And then there's a little while where you're in your stride and then you start getting jaded and then you go, and I feel that it's not the same thing, but the politics is a bit like that, particularly political leadership. There is an interesting term that they use in Zimbabwe, and I think they probably in South Africa, where they talk about the born freeze. Because this generational gap is particularly significant in a country where if you're above a certain age, the ANC has a particular meaning to you as the party of liberation. And if you're below a certain age, it's a bit like Diane Abbott was always there for you because you're so young, that the ANC is just a party of government. That was my under the radar. Now for a short break. So over the top for me is the Donald Trump trial. Now, clearly, what I don't mean is that people shouldn't cover it. He's a former president. He's on trial for a violation that's related to an election. it's important or it's relevant.
This is, wait, just so we're clear before we get into it, which trial?
Yes, there are quite a few. So this is the trial where Donald Trump is accused of paying hush money to adult film actress Stormy Daniels in order to keep her from selling the story that they had sex or airing the story that he had sex with her. There was a fear that she would do that before the election. He didn't want her to do that before the election. So he got his fixer, who's a lawyer called Michael Cohen, to pay her off. And then it was written off as a business expense. As a lawyer, he just paid his lawyer. So that is what the trial is about. Is that what he did? And is that why he did it? And the reason why I think the way it's being covered is over the top is because, first of all, there is no evidence that it's making any difference politically or electorally, let's say, that he actually, while the trial's been on, he has overtaken Joe Biden in terms of money raising. To the extent it's having an effect electorally, it's actually doing him some good, probably. And that's because for a certain kind of white Republican, he is their OJ. He's a white OJ for a certain kind of white Republican. His guilt or innocence is not the point. And so he becomes martyr. If he's not convicted, then he's exonerated. The system's still crooked. If he is, he's a martyr. The likelihood of him going to jail is very, very slim. But there's also this shortcut that liberals want, I think, liberals in particular. They want him to be gone, but they don't want to do the work to defeat him politically. So they want the legal system to do it for them. Now, the legal system has to run its course. So I'm not saying that that should stop. What's important is to defeat his ideas and defeat the things that make him popular. Locking him up is not going to do that. And all of that is wrapped up in the coverage, and it makes it a kind of spectacle. And actually, he thrives on the spectacle.
Yeah, I mean, he's getting a lot of free media, right? So yeah, I'm with you in that it's probably overreported because it's sex and it's Trump. And I think you're right, it's also over the top in terms of it's not going to be an effective political tactic to neutralize him. I personally am still very worried he's going to win again. One of the things I've always thought about the American legal system, which is very different to the British one, is that the cameras in courtrooms sort of feeds the like sensationalist, dramatic vibe. And I think it is, yeah, I mean, it's testament to Donald Trump and to political reporters that without cameras, they've still managed to manufacture, the same amount of drama.
He also has a weird thing. He keeps doing the Black Power salute. Do you see that? He comes out and he and I'm like, dude.
He's doing the fist.
Give us that back. That's not yours. No. You can't have that.
Yeah. They've taken so much from us, Gary. They're taking the fist. That's too far. How are we going to talk about Trump? Because we're doing a podcast. He is likely to be one of the presidential candidates.
Well, we are going to have to be sober in our assessment. There's something about intent. What are we trying to do here? Are we trying to entertain people with this? Or are we trying to make a point? Obviously, it's possible to do two things at once, but my point here largely is this desire not to deal with what he represents politically, and that the trial becomes a kind of proxy for that, a convenient place to put it all. And the way that, like OJ, people are watching the same thing, but they're not seeing the same thing. They're not understanding the same thing. And that it is the primary significance of this isn't in the courtroom. It's elsewhere.
Less about Donald's sex life and more about his politics.
I never want to talk about his dick again.
Okay, so my under the radar for this week is dating apps.
So, Carys, because I'm an old man, this is before my time. In my time, there were no dating apps. There was no dating. You didn't call it dating. It was all about plausible deniability.
Wait, talk me through this.
Maybe this was just my MO, but I feel like it was the kind of way that it was. Do you fancy going to the, there's this film on, do you want to go see that? Or what are you up to Tuesday? Do you want to go to for a drink? And maybe there'll be other people there, maybe they wouldn't. Okay. It was all serendipitous, But at no stage, and I just thought this was a very British thing, at no stage would it be openly declared. You know, we are a nation without a written constitution. And so at no stage would it be openly declared, I have a romantic interest in you. Dating apps, I've got to tell you, they scare the shit out of me.
You're not the only one, Gary. So the story that I think has gone under the radar is there've been a few studies showing two things. One, that younger generations and women in particular are deleting their dating apps. And then a study by Forbes that, again, a few people have done similar research finding is this idea of dating app burnout.
And what does that mean, burnout?
There are a lot of different things. Basically that it's making you feel shit about yourself. You feel sad you haven't found someone. I mean, so these apps, for people who don't use them, there are lots of online dating apps, but specifically the ones that have really blown up are the mobile-based ones like Tinder, Grindr, Bumble, and Hinge. Some people would be very familiar with this, but popularized by Tinder, this idea of swiping. So old school online dating that we had in like the 90s and early noughties, you were on your laptop, you made a profile, maybe you used Guardian Soulmate or eHarmony, and it was all a little bit stigmatized and, oh, if you met someone online, you might lie about it. Whereas Tinder and Grindr and this new generation of apps that you can have on your phone changed online dating in two ways. So number one, massively lowered the bar to entry. So most of these apps are freemium, so you can use it for free. And then if you pay, you get different features. And then the second thing was this concept of swiping. And so for those who aren't using dating apps or familiar, this idea of swiping left or swiping right. So you see a picture, a tile comes up, Gary Young, professor, Ireland or Stevenage, has your age. And then you can kind of look and see some pictures of you cuddling a kitten, picture of you at a festival. You know, there are some tropes around what you do to show, I have friends, I have hobbies.
Oh, right.
I am a human.
Are there people like, oh, this is just me working out with a really oiled body? Is it?
Yeah.
Okay.
There's a lot of those. There's a lot of those, Gary. A lot of gratuitous gym shots. And then you can swipe left or right. So basically it's turned something that was a little bit more involved into a sort of quick click of the button, yes or no, like hitting like on Instagram. And actually, Jonathan Badeen, who's one of the founders of Tinder, which popularized the swipe, has admitted that he stole it from, I think it's a B.F. Skinner experiment, where you incentivize pigeons to sort of peck like a button because it released food. So as with a lot of these social media apps, they are really addictive and compelling because they're using old psychological experiments to incentivize you and like give you a dopamine hit that makes you keep coming back. On the one hand, it's a way to meet people. And I mean, the founder of Grindr has talked a lot about what it meant as a gay man to be able to know that someone else was gay in a safe way. So there's some really cool stuff about dating apps. But I think the thing that's happened that we get with a lot of social media platforms, because ultimately they're big technology companies that are trying to harvest our attention, is that they've become pretty unpleasant places, especially for women, especially for people from marginalized communities. It will shock you to hear. And I think the other thing that we've seen with these dating apps that really only want you to spend lots of time on them so they can harvest data or pay to use them so they can make money, is that you've got no social connection to the people you're matching with. So there's absolutely no accountability. You know, when your fuckboy mate dates your friend and doesn't call her, there's a bit of a feedback loop there. You can be like, I'm not going to name one of my fuckboy mates, that would be unfair. You can be like, dude, why haven't you called her?
Fuckboy mates.
You know what a fuckboy is, Gary?
No,
Come on.
I'm assuming it's a straight man who likes sex a lot.
Okay, so nearly there. A fuckboy, and write in if I've got this wrong, is a guy who presumably he likes sex, but also misbehaves in a dating context. So he might sleep with you and not call you back.
A cad.
Yes, he's a cad, a bounder.
A cad. See, now you're getting closer to my generation.
That's how you were talking.
Yes.
Yeah,
in Stevenage in the 80s, they were all cads and bounders we talked about.
Cads and bounders everywhere. And women dropping handkerchiefs and flashing their ankles.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think there's a thing where there's no accountability suddenly. You can misbehave, you can ghost people. I've ghosted people. I'm sorry to those I've ghosted. There's no comeback. There's no friend being like, that wasn't very nice. Some estimates, like 40% of people in the UK using dating apps. Ofcom say 2.49 million people use Tinder. They say 1 million people use Hinge. About the same use Bumble. So it's affecting a lot of people of all ages. And yeah, there's very little accountability. And a lot of these apps are all owned by this one company, Match Group. So they own OkCupid, Tinder, Hinge. So one company owns most of the dating apps.
I mean, there is a through line in this, I think. Not all of it, but in some of it, which is loneliness, which I do think is part of like life under late stage capitalism. We're all atomized. For better and for worse, we work at home. We don't have to be watching the same things because, you know, everything's streamed. We don't have to be, we're not keeping regular hours. There is a range of ways in which that flexibility suits us, but there are a range of ways in which it makes us miserable.
Oof. Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. Deep cut, Gary. But yeah, I think loneliness does sit behind a lot of this. And then the sad part is that we're social beings and we crave connection and we crave belonging. And sometimes you do get that from your phone, like from a funny WhatsApp group chat or from a ridiculous Twitter thread about Nashy Serv. But increasingly, I feel like that's going against the grain of what these devices and what these platforms are trying to do. So yeah, there is a lot of loneliness. We're going to get on to hearing from some of you who've made us feel a bit less lonely, recording this podcast into ether. Michael writes in and he says he's got friends who actively don't vote and say things like, it's a white thing, ain't done nothing for me. So his question to us, Gary, is how do we... Voting is a white thing that has sent me, is how do you convince folk to vote, and particularly black men? Interested to hear your view and keep up the good work. Thanks, Michael, for writing in.
You know, I think you convince them by giving them something to vote for. When people don't vote, and I don't think we can blame them, I think we have to blame the system for not providing them with something that they want. But I also think that it matters what happens to your vote. So I do think that if you live in a first past the post system, then there's only about 50 constituencies, maybe a few more, that are really, really where your vote will be decisive. And everywhere else, you live in a Tory stronghold or a Labour stronghold, maybe a Lib Dem stronghold. So then voting is like a civic ritual, but it's not kind of particularly consequential.
Yeah, I agree. In a sense, it's a rational decision not to vote if there's nothing on offer for you. But I think especially for black people, you know, I still do believe that voting is a way to exercise your political power. It's not the only way. Often it's not the best way, especially in our first past the post system.
This is Dowdy music. Pooping rules on tour bus. Hi, Gary and Carys. Hope you're both well. I've been really enjoying your podcast. I thought I'd share my experiences with you. Read your discussion on pooping on buses. This is not an email I ever thought that I would hear myself reading. I'm a musician, and over the years, I've done a few tours traveling on a tour bus. Last year, I spent about 21 days on one. It's a universal rule, at least for musicians on tour buses, that pooping on the bus is 100% no-go. The rule exists for a couple of reasons, maybe. It's the driver's job to clean the loos and the waste tanks. 21-day run of shows with 8 to 16 adults with limited access to fresh vegetables. You can imagine how appealing that may be. And 2, I don't think the waste management systems on tour buses are very well equipped to deal with solids.
I mean,
there's so much going on there.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, Pete Fraser also wrote in, and generally, yeah, I've never received so many emails and social media messages about poo in my life. I hope to never again. But yeah, so it sounds like it's actually a progressive thing because you're supporting the bus driver. No number twos. I'm
glad to have been educated on that matter. It's
mystery solved.
Yeah.
Mystery solved, Gary, by the musicians.
Yes.
Yeah. And also thanks to everyone who wrote in or tweeted or sent us a message. We don't have time to read them all, but Gary and I and the team did really enjoy reading them, especially solving the pooping mystery.
So thanks for listening to Over the Top and Under the Radar. Remember to like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
The exclusive, over the top and under the radar WhatsApp community is coming soon. So if you sign up to our newsletter at overunderpod.com, you can find out how to join up.
Email us at info@overunderpod.com.
And the podcast is on all social media at over_under_pod_.